This is the Change Physician, episode 193. Welcome back to the Change Physician. I am Melissa Katie, the Challenge Doctor, with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro. And we were discussing this idea of what is your kryptonite? And of course, it's always good to go back to the definition because sometimes my interpretation can be slightly off.
Well, and let's bring that up a little bit here because what I like about defining is, this is outside the episode, is it if we have common definitions, it means we can have a discussion. And so we were discussing this, what is your kryptonite thing? And it was fairly obvious we were thinking completely different things. Yeah. I would like to say that my definition was a little bit better because obviously it seems
more accurate.
I'm a little bit more into the Marvel universe apparently than Dr. Katie is.
Yes.
Or not, oh my God, I just totally blew it, into the DC universe because Superman is not in Marvel.
Wow.
Oh,
okay, Corey, my husband would have got you on that one.
He would have got me. I'm glad I picked it up because someone would have nailed me on that one.
Yeah,
comments. But at least I'm familiar with. I'm pretty familiar with the ideas of Superman in the DC universe and Kryptonite.
Okay, well, there's no better place than thank you Wikipedia for having a free encyclopedia online. And if you don't have a place to donate money, I guess you could help out Wikipedia. I always seem to get those requests, but it says kryptonite is a fictional material that appears primarily in Superman stories. In its best known form, it is a green crystalline material originating from Superman's home world of Krypton that emits a unique radiation that weakens Kryptonians. It is generally harmless to humans in the short term, but deadly in the long term. There are other varieties of kryptonite, such as red and gold kryptonite, which have different but still generally negative effects. Due to Superman's popularity, kryptonite has become a byword for an extraordinary exploitable weakness, synonymous with Achilles Heel. Batman and Lex Luthor are two notable individuals who have pieces of kryptonite with them, the former being trusted by Superman to stop him if he goes rogue, and the latter using the mineral to ward off Superman, sometimes incorporating it into weapons to try to kill him. So there you go. There's a little detailed version of our definition.
And we talked about, and so off air, what we were talking about, like one of the kind of key things about kryptonite is it's a specific sort of weakness that derails you. It's not something that could be considered a strength if we flip it. It's not necessarily something that can be considered a difficult thing that you have every day, like eating healthy. It's really something that comes in at a specific moment of time when you think you're doing well and can completely throw you off the path, and so part of that importance with kryptonite then, in kind of the discussion, at least kind of what I was thinking about, is being aware then of these really specific, beyond weakness, but it's something specific that there's not really a way that if it's presented per se, there's a lot you can do to fight off it, right? So if for Superman, when kryptonite, if he's surprised by kryptonite, man, he's screwed. So his only options then are to avoid kryptonite, prepare in advance for that possible kryptonite episode. But the biggest one, obviously, is to make sure that it never is there. So my thing, if you're identifying kryptonite, is then, well, what are the specific things that you or I, like I mentioned a couple before we got on there, like I know that I've identified myself, my specific kryptonites, that are things that you then identify as active inhibitors or in a super bad way of some specific goal or activity that you're looking for, and then strategies that you've had to deal with them.
Yeah. Well, we talked about one particular area when it comes to our diet. There's our types of foods.
Yeah.
I think now it takes a lot of effort or being very focused to avoid these things, but when I do have them, boy, they're great, and of course you want more of it, and that would be frosted animal cookies. I'll eat the whole damn bag. The white and the pink ones, I love them. In college I always got a TSBY shiver, which is basically frozen yogurt, white chocolate mousse. Is fantastic. And I would get like Butterfinger or the little white chocolate chips or the little butterscotch chips, and I'd have it mixed in there in a flurry, kind of not Dairy Queen flurry stuff. But anyway, that stuff, yeah, I could, it starts me out. Once you start obviously with a high, level of sugar, it makes you just want more. So if I don't want to go crazy on that stuff, I just have to avoid it completely. But I guess if I was on my deathbed and I wanted like my favorite things, those would probably be some of the things that I would want, and I wouldn't care. But yeah, those are the first things I think of from a dietary weakness standpoint. Do you have any of those?
Yeah, and I guess mine be a little bit more general, because it would be when you're thinking about diet, the kryptonite for me is actually the act of eating, if I want to say it like that way, right?
Yeah.
So if we're looking at kind of moderating your calories, and I like an idea behind this comes from Gretchen Rubin, who wrote a couple books, but I saw her talk once, and she talked about abstainers versus moderators. And my suspicion is you probably are a much better moderator. And then there's abstainers. Moderators are people who can moderate what they're eating. Like, so you can eat and then you can stop in general. Now you may have, eaten a TCBI shiver or whatever, and maybe over the top, but in general, you might be able to eat and then stop. My wife is a perfect example of a moderator. She can have 1 or 2 bites of something and she can stop. I am, on the other hand, or what is called an abstainer. Abstainers are either on or off. So if I take a bite of something, I will take many more bites of that something. It's like once the switch is on, it doesn't stop. And so my kryptonite, when it comes to sort of diet, is the fact that if I break the fast and I don't have boundaries on that fast, it will easily derail, like without a doubt. And then if I think about I think about health, my major deficiencies right now that have been for a long time are sleep and probably nutrition. And it's what I'm eating and how much I eat, given that as we get older, that number has to go down. And so I really feel like if I'm, once I break that fast, if the environment is not set up, I'm not prepped in certain ways, it will derail everything for me, just like Superman and Kryptonite. It is almost impossible for me to cover up until I make the decision to turn it off. So for me, it's that the best thing that I've seen for this is moderating when I actually eat. And that's a whole, time restricted eating, and the recent study that came out is something else. But it's a preparatory to identify a pretty big weakness, and knowing that in order to avoid that weakness, these are the set of things I have to prepare in advance. Because if I don't prepare, then like you go on vacation, like it could be bad, other than just don't eat breakfast or whatever.
Yeah, actually, I think I do both. I am much better when I abstain, for sure. Like I feel like I'm the healthiest, and I can become, just fitter in general. If, of course, creating your day, the things I've learned is that if I go out and be outside and I'm doing things, I'm not hungry. Like I'm so in the moment, and I'm so like, to me, it's just the activity itself quells my appetite, and I don't think about it. I can go all day long, like literally till 3 in the afternoon, 4 in the afternoon, realize I hadn't eaten. I mean, I'm having water or whatever, but literally that's fine. But if I have no activity and I start my day with something, then I'm eating all day. Like I'm grazing all day. And yes, I can moderate myself, but it's fascinating. And I really think a lot of this is just the whole glucagon insulin exchange and the whole physiological aspect to it, based on what you're doing or not doing. And once you initiate that eating, the fluctuations, I'm more than happy to hear what you have to say about that. But I really think there's a lot to do with it when you get the insulin spikes, especially if you're eating sugar versus like proteins and fats where you're more satiated. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I want to be focusing on kryptonite here. So
I know, but I think it makes your physiology can make you more vulnerable to it. I think the weakness can be exacerbated and more hard to overcome is my point by that. But yes, my kryptonite, there's a strong influence based on what I eat. A lot of it's sugar based. It could be any sugar, but those are my favorite things that I'll go for.
But do you have anything specific then that you know is, you know, like Superman doesn't go around, Superman knows kryptonite and he avoids it. So is there anything specific in your, you know, it could be a person, environment, and it could be food, it could be anything that is so detrimental to you that you make a point of making sure that you avoid it, and which is something that is different, right? A lot of times we don't want avoidant behavior is not necessarily a wonderful long-term strategy, but there are certain things where it makes sense that avoidance actually is protective.
Yeah. So I never thought this was going to come up in our podcast recording. For over a decade, I avoided my ex-husband, mainly because I felt the weakness that I wasn't strong enough to deal with that vulnerability. And that's probably the only thing that really just like hit my brain right when you said that was, holy crap, that is the only person that I can think of that I intentionally tried to avoid because emotionally I felt vulnerable, that I would fall back into a relationship that was not healthy for me.
Well, and I think that's an important point here, that because that's a kryptonite, right? Is when you recognize that something that could potential exposure to can not only just derail you, but can really mess things up because of how it makes you feel. And that's different than, say, in a relationship or someone that you're dealing with that is confrontational, and then you know there's something bad. It's something that you do not. I'm going to frame this in such a way as it's something you don't want to work on it because it's so painful or dangerous to you.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important distinguishing mark, because again, avoidance as a lifelong strategy is not good, but being aware enough of the impact of whatever that encounter is, whether it's an individual versus a substance, is being aware enough to realize that you don't have the strength to deal with it. I would say, but the strategy itself is then to push it away and keep it away from you. Makes sense. I would think, the same way I would think of somebody who's got a substance use problem, right? There is some arguments with substance use about whether you're a lifelong alcoholic or not, and blah, blah, blah. But if you have a big problem with substance use disorder, then it makes more sense to stay away from the substance 100% of the time, because that would be your kryptonite. Like if you were, heroin's your kryptonite, you don't want to be around in the environment when it's potentially even around, because it can totally derail you. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And some people say, well, you need to learn through your relationships. Some relationships are so bad or have been so bad that the avoidance of them is actually a survival tactic that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And let me be clear that I've never, we are on good terms. I've never felt like I've, been threatened by this, leaving this relationship. It was well understood on the other half that this was, warranted, that we are not in a relationship. But I feel like I have more conviction and strength to be able to be around that person. It's just for so long. It's very complicated. There's a lot of depth to it. There's 13 years around this person and you sacrifice a lot of your life, and the dynamics were not healthy. There wasn't the right time, the right mix of people. So there's such an emotional charge that comes with that being in their presence was the biggest concern, because of more so back then where you felt like you're going to slip back into it. Yeah. But that is of course, that was like one of the biggest events that's happened in my life was, leaving a marriage. But so you can imagine there's an intensity of emotion there that the pain, it was a sense of protection. There's a lot of rationalization that went on for so many years. And then the protection you do to avoid because you felt weakness around that person. You didn't have the ability in all those years to do the right thing or walk away. And so you finally get away and you finally get the strength to do it, but you still feel vulnerable that you might slip back in. That's probably the biggest kryptonite of my life. I mean,
and I think that's probably a common one, is that people can be kryptonite.
yeah.
Right? And we know about bad influences. But yeah, being around the wrong person can completely derail people's behavior. And this I didn't even think about this until before, but this comes back to sort of like, if you're, one of the strategies for growth and change that you can do is to change your environment and change the environment of people that you're in.
Mm-hmm.
And so it'd be interesting to kind of, like, I'm going to use substance use disorder again is a big one. That's a big kryptonite. We know there's a high rate where people go back to using substance again. It's a huge, big challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that very likely is twofold. There's the environment and then there's the people around it.
Mm-hmm.
And when that's your sense of connection, then to be able to free yourself from that kind of kryptonite, you have to replace that with a new environment, and you have to replace it with new people who aren't in that sort of sphere of influence anymore, which can be extraordinarily challenging, particularly when you look at all the kind of socioeconomic issues that are surrounding substance use disorder and things. But I guess, so if I was coming from a takeaway in understanding kryptonite, for me, the things to remember is, one, kryptonite is these things that are really, they're generally kind of specific things that can derail you completely. To prep for that, you have to be aware enough of what they are. So you have to be aware of the destruction that's associated with this kryptonite, whether it's an eating problem, a substance use disorder, whether it's a specific person, or even a specific environment, like we're talking about toxic workplaces and things.
Mm-hmm.
So then the thing to kind of keep in that mind then is, well, how can you, I'm going to use the word, to literally, like, how do you cut that substance out in such a way that you can go someplace else to either regain strength if you've been exposed to kryptonite for a long period of time, or to prevent it from interrupting your life again. And so, I don't know, do you have any thoughts about how you can change your environment or change others in that place? Get rid of the Lex Luthors who want to bring in that kryptonite towards you.
Well, my personal situation, I had to be very clear with very strong communication with that person. For the first time in my life, I created a boundary. That was the other weakness in my own personality, character. I don't know how you would define that, but I think a lot of women go through a lot of this where they, and it can be very cultural or your upbringing, but very much trying to please others, keep others happy. And then you end up not creating boundaries for yourself. And then you can create an environment that allow an environment, if that other person chooses those actions, it can be very unhealthy. So I think when you're in a place where this person is like kryptonite, you sense that you have an awareness that you are not in a healthy space, or it's not good for you, that you have to create that boundary. And for me, it was physically remove myself from the situation and make it very clear. In this case, the safest thing for me was a phone call, and make very strong statements as to, this is unacceptable and this is no longer going to continue, and I'm out. And then, time was the thing that helped me heal. I'm sure there's still remnants within me that still need to heal, but there's that time was critical. I mean, there was no other way to get around that. But I think finding a way, and I don't mean just relationships, but if it is involving individuals, you have to get some clarity on, is this something you want, and is this good for you? And if it's not, you need to create a boundary. You need to communicate that whatever way is safe for you. And then, and it doesn't mean safe like as physically necessarily safe. It could be, but safe for you to feel like you can remove yourself from the kryptonite and move and create a different environment for yourself. And it's not necessarily easy. And it's something my mother and I talked about, is that sometimes you rip the Band-Aid off when suddenly you create a change like that. We've talked about change, the change physician. Sometimes change itself is so painful, even though you know you need to remove yourself from the kryptonite, get into a different environment. That shift and that change is traumatic sometimes for the mind. And literally the brain is trying to make sense of your new world. And it's not easy to redefine this new world and what your identity is within this new world. That's very general, but I think it's really important, because that's where the resistance and the pain is that shift. I don't know, any thoughts about that?
I think the biggest takeaway I had from this was the idea of space, right? And that aligns really, really well with that, with the fundamental idea of kryptonite, that there's this physicality, or it's when it is in your presence, which then would infer, and supported by the comic books, that the best thing then to do is to create that space in between you and the kryptonite. And in most situations, it would be a physical space, like when you were talking about extruding yourself from the physical space, and then maintaining that space by the phone, right? Because that allows you to do that. And the other way would be time. So I'm thinking specifically when I come to difficulties with eating, it's creating, I increase the space because I'm doing basically time restriction, because there are very specific boundaries, and it's by pulling apart that space that provides that protective barrier or moat that's associated with it. So yeah, I think I want to actually think more about this, because you can almost think about things as different types of threats or different types of challenges in your life. And if we can sort of identify the types, like there's the kryptonite type, there's probably very specific interactions that you can, or I should say there's a general approach you can do that can have a specific point of intervention for you. And for a kryptonite one, where they're so kind of destructive and you know, the danger of them is if they're in your immediate vicinity, there's a weakening of willpower, weakening of will, weakening of health. If you can identify those key kryptonite things, then the way to attack those is to build those spaces.
Yeah.
So how do you build those space?
Well, it's interesting too about some other conversations we had, that if something in your presence creates anger, what do they tell you to do? Remove yourself from the situation, go take a walk, breathe, process whatever it is. You know, kryptonite can manifest itself in different kinds of, if you can call it weakness. It can manifest different types of feelings, sensations, reactions, just vulnerabilities. So
that are destructive to the individual, though. I mean, that's one of the key things. It's destructive to the individual.
Well, and yeah, but anger is one of those things too that
is destructive to the individual.
Yeah. I'm just thinking like the space thing can apply to a lot of different.
Oh yeah.
situations.
Well, because then you look at space as building a physical space is a defensive mechanism, whether it's psychological or physical. I guess, but what I like is that you have to identify the specific threats or challenges. There are many different protective measures that you can do, but it seems to be, if it's a kryptonite, where it is like the very presence of it is weakens and destroys you, and that's a big grandiose term, but in many ways they do, then one of the key strategies then for a kryptonite is to build the space to prevent it from entering your zone.
Yeah.
So that was a useful takeaway for me.
Yeah. Well, in toxic environments, toxic surgeons, maybe you just don't get paired up with that guy or girl or whatever lady, or the environment itself. Maybe that means you don't need to do this 5 days a week. If you have to do that kind of work, you create space and do it less frequently. There's a lot of ways I think you can interpret that.
Yeah.
Well, I think that was a good takeaway. to
Well,
be
it's useful
aware.
for me, which is always useful. You know, I use the discussions. It allows me to kind of process this stuff. And I do. That's the biggest takeaway for me is if you identify something that is a kryptonite, then the key defensive strategy, at least in my mind, is to build that space. You have to be able to build that space that keeps that kryptonite at a distance from you.
Yeah.
And that is that, you know, there's compensatory method, you know, other things that like anything that, you know, if the kryptonite arrives, what are you going to do? But the ideal scenario, if you've pre-identified kryptonite in your life, again, whether that's a relationship, whether that's a nutritional thing, a toxic work environment, the number one thing to be focusing on is how do you build a space between you and that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that's my big takeaway.
Well, I think you're saying, I think you should take us out and kind of just
Take us out.
pull
Put
that
a
around.
space. Let's put a space.
Put a space in there. And yeah, I think if there's, I think there's a, you know, we can't deny there's things that we can all work on as individuals, you know, that we can, you know, but if there truly is something that despite your efforts and you can't, you know, you can't find a way to like, there's nothing, it appears that there's nothing else you can do other than you need to create space. That might be the healthiest thing for you to do. You know, I'm not a psychologist, psychiatrist or anything, but I think some common sense human experience can go a long way too. But yeah, well, I think your summary and takeaway is probably the keep it simple. And I'll let you take us out.
Keep it simple. That's my other thing. I just keep thinking, keep it simple.
Yeah.
You know. All right. Well, anyway, that folks, that's a little discussion of kryptonite. So I was going to challenge you guys to identify a specific kryptonite in your life. We all got them. I'm going to put up some boundaries here. Kryptonite is something very specific to you. It's something that when it's in your presence, and again, multiple different things there, but what's in that presence, it not only weakens you, but actually sort of destroys you and decreases you. So it makes you less than what you were before. And then once you've identified that kryptonite, what are some strategies that you can do to build that space to prevent it from being next to you and causing that sort of destructive environment? So with that, I'll say, if you got those ideas, you can always let us know at thechangedphysician.com or email me directly at drkevin@thechangedphysician.com. And until next time, stay well.
Take care.